too. So Wesley said he would message me when we're live. We're live. Terrific. Hi, everyone. My name is Beth Gilligan from the Coolidge Corner Theatre. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for this live Q&A for City Hall. It is currently playing in the Coolidge's virtual screening room. You can access it by tickets at www.coolidge.org or at your local art house. Purchasing films on our virtual screening room is a huge help to us during this time. Our doors have been closed nearly 8 months. We are an independent nonprofit organization, so we just love it when people rent films. It helps us feel connected to you. And you're also, in this instance, getting to see a great work by an amazing filmmaker. Joining us today are the filmmaker, Frederick Wiseman. He's going to be joined in conversation with WBUR's Arteries film critic, Sean Burns. So without further ado, take it away. Thank you.
Hello.
So, Fred, I have to say, I can't think of a better week to be talking to my favorite small d Democratic filmmaker, possibly capital D too, as the past week we've watched democracy in action. We've watched the process. I found myself transfixed watching the live stream of the Philadelphia vote counting. And I thought, this feels like a Frederick Wiseman movie. I wonder, now I understand you're in France. What was the view of this past week from
well, people I know were very happy. Yesterday and today, I got 10 messages and emails from friends of mine congratulating me as if I had anything to do with it. But I was happy to share or participate in their enthusiasm. But everybody everybody I know was extremely relieved because for all the obvious reasons. Trump is crazy. He's an authoritarian. Although he doesn't know what the word authoritarian or fascist means, he's an authoritarian and a fascist. And the damage he's done to democracy is serious, and I hope that it can be repaired.
It was nice to see this week watching the process work and seeing seeing like the clerk from Nevada was such a character out of a Wiseman movie. And the great way to segue into City Hall, because I feel like you get into the grunt work of how a government works. And I want to know your approach. Did you just look at the building one day and say, we're going to do this one next?
Well, I had the idea that a city hall might fit in well with this institutional series that I've been doing, because City Hall administers a lot of the institutions that have been the subjects of my other films. For example, police, public housing, public hospitals, aspects of welfare, homelessness, etc., all of which have been in whole or in part subjects of my other films. So I thought it would be interesting to have a look at how a city government functions. Although other than my political science courses in college, which were sometime after the American Civil War, I had no experience with City Hall, and I wrote letters to a number of city halls, and Boston was, I think, the only one that responded. And I was very lucky because my letter to the mayor was opened by one of his administrative assistants who in turn handed it over to his head of policy planning. And she had seen some of my films and she liked them. So she invited me to come in and talk to her. And I came in and talked to her and I met the mayor and they said, okay.
So there's no negotiation.
Sheer luck.
So you didn't have to negotiate access or you can see this, you can't see this. It was just, I'm going to show up.
And then the mayor said, basically, I could film anything I wanted. There were some situations where there were meetings that were private, and I understood that. I don't think I have any given right to shoot everything, but by and large, I had access to everything that was going on. And occasionally a citizen that was coming in to see the mayor that didn't want to be photographed, and I respected that. But I would say that permission was not a problem. And I appreciated the fact that the mayor and Joyce Linehan, who was the head of policy planning, took the view that government is transparent and they wanted me to shoot whatever was going on.
What I'm really taken with about the film is you show the scope of which the city government affects our lives, from going from pest control to tree removal to my favorite scene is the garbage truck.
Oh, good. Yeah, I like that too. Well, it's interesting. I tried to edit the garbage truck in such a way as to give a sense of the work and to create a feeling for the internal rhythm of the work. And although the sequence isn't more than, I think, in a minute and a half, there must be at least 15 or 20 shots in it. And the shots are relatively short duration. But I tried to show not only that there was garbage collection in Boston, but I tried to give a sense of what it was like for the people who collected the garbage and what they had to do, and also what people threw out. Because I thought that was interesting.
Well, there's a build to the scene. It's brilliantly edited because you're getting to then the box spring, and then my God, the grill.
Yeah, well, and the giant claw of the garbage truck sort of eating everything that came within its range. It was fun. I mean, it's also funny.
So I'm wondering about, so many of your movies are about process and how things work. And I'm curious as to how a Fred Wiseman movie works. Because first of all, I saw this behind the scenes clip of you and your cinematographer shooting, and you're holding the boom.
Right. Well, the crew consists of me, and I direct and I do the sound. I work with a very good cameraman, John Davey, and the third person carries the extra equipment, the lenses and the cards. When we shot on film, we used to carry the extra magazines and extra rolls of film, and some of the film is shot off a tripod, but a good part of it is handheld. And basically, the technique is to roam around and collect footage. And I don't have much time to think about what I've collected during the shooting, but I tried to collect a lot of footage of things. And basically, I filmed things that interest me. For City Hall, I wanted to get a sense of what the senior staff did and the kind of meetings they conducted. And I wanted to get some sense of how the mayor spent his time. But I also wanted to go out with people who worked for various departments, so that I went out with a building inspector who had to pass on construction of a condo in East Boston. I went out with a health inspector who'd received a complaint that there were mice in an apartment in, I think, in Jamaica Plain. I wanted to show, because I wanted to show this because I quickly realized, I didn't really think about it much in advance, but after I've been to City Hall a while, I had some sense of the enormous diversity of activities that were controlled and performed by people who work for the city government. And city government touches more aspects of our lives than any other form of government, whether it's state or federal. Just to make a small list: birth, marriage, death, police, fire, housing, homelessness, public health, garbage collection, waste disposal, restaurant inspection, clean water, all the various aspects of public safety. I mean, the list is enormous, and they're services that we take for granted and only really become conscious of them whether we come in contact with them because we violated an ordinance or because for some reason the service wasn't performed. But most of us take for granted this diversity of services. And I wanted to suggest what they were.
Yeah, it's so funny because we've had in the past, I don't know, since with Reagan. I guess so much the government is the problem. And there's so much anti-government sentiment we're inundated with. And I believe I referred to your film as quietly radical because, you know, it's just this insistence that governments provide these things to people, and here's everyone who does the work.
Right.
And you
And,
don't
you know,
favor any particular people. It's into all of your films. You don't. There's no identifying tags. There's no one-to-one interviews. When I watch your films, I feel like we're all part of the same organism.
yeah, well, I think that's right. And obviously, some governments perform it better than others. But I think I was particularly fortunate in being able to film in Boston because I think Mayor Walsh and the city employees do, my impression was they care and they do a very good job. And they want to offer the best possible services to the citizens. And that's not a matter of politics. I think it's a matter of interest in good government.
Now, were you worried about, I know you don't care much about the receptions of things like this, but you're worried about it seeming like a campaign ad for Marty Walsh?
No. I mean, it comes out the way it comes out.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it shows Mayor Walsh in a good light, but that's what I found. I mean, I knew I'd never met him before I met him that day that I went to the office, and I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with him. And I think he's an important figure in the film because he as the mayor, he's an important person in Boston, and I don't know how many talks, how many meetings he has with constituents every day, but I think on many days there are at least 4 or 5. And he gets out and about in the city, and part of his job is to meet the citizens and hear what they have to, as well as telling them about services that are available. He has the capacity to listen and respond to their needs and interests. So I didn't set out to make a movie either praising or condemning Mayor Walsh. I set out to make a movie that explored Boston city government. And what you see in the movie is what I found, what I discovered.
That was one of my big takeaways, was just the staggering number of speaking engagements he has to do.
Yeah.
It's constant because it's not just implementing policies, but it's explaining to them. There's also an aspect of the movie where you have to sell this stuff before you can do it.
Well, you have to sell it and also make people aware of it. For instance, he talks to a group of elderly citizens in Roxbury, and he basically says there's an elderly hotline. It's not used enough. It's for you. Call it. That's why it was set up. You know, and I guess some of the people there knew of its existence. Some of them may have known of it and didn't use it. But he was basically in that meeting, in part, proselytizing for the use of a city service that was underused.
So the portrayal of Boston to me is, as a moviegoer, is often extremely frustrating because, you know, as is repeated a lot in City Hall, where this is a minority majority city, and every movie is about like Go Sox, the Wahlburgers, like, you know, there's this one stereotype of people from Boston, which is very funny and entertaining. But I was wondering if you talk about the diversity you see in this film and the different neighborhoods that you.
Well, I grew up in Brighton, and when I was young, I knew something about Boston because I went around to different neighborhoods, and my grandfather lived in Roxbury, and I knew something. I had relatives who lived in Dorchester, and I went to the North End. But since I was about 20, which was quite a while ago, I really hadn't spent much time in Boston, even though I live in Cambridge. But when I was in Cambridge, I was busy editing, and I didn't go to Boston that much, maybe occasionally to the movies. And I didn't really follow Boston politics. But I certainly knew from my childhood that Boston was, when my childhood, Boston was a highly ghettoized city. And, if you're Irish, you lived in South Boston. If you were Italian, you lived in the North End. If you were Jewish, you lived in Roxbury. And when I was young, there weren't that many. The Black population in Boston wasn't very big, and there weren't as many immigrants from Africa and South America. but it was highly ghettoized. I mean, there were areas of Boston where Jews couldn't buy houses. I mean, it was very rare, very difficult for a Jew to own a house in Brookline, for example. I mean, now, or Newton, but now it's simply an issue. And that was true until after the Second World War. I mean, Harvard had a Jewish quota until 1950. Yale had a Jewish quota, I mean, not that Yale's in Boston, but just another example, until 1960. So ethnicity was a big issue in Boston politics. And it still is, but it's so many different ethnic groups. The speech that Mayor Walsh gives to the Latinx group of city employees, where he basically urges them to participate in city government, whether as employees or politically, he's telling them, he makes a point of telling them how other ethnic groups attain power. You work in neighborhoods, and you elect local people, and you elect city councilmen, and then eventually you elect a mayor. And he said, we did it. And he outlines to them to the kind of opposition that the Irish had in following that route. And he urges them to participate in politics, and and points out that they will succeed if they do it.
So we've got a question here from Leslie. Wants to know, how many hours of footage did you shoot?
104.
104. Okay,
Which is a bit less than usual for at Berkeley, which is a film at the University of California at Berkeley. I shot 250. For Ex Libris, which is about the New York Public Library, it was 150. So this was at the low end for me.
Yeah, so I'm fascinated with your editing style and everything. So you have all this footage now. Your movies aren't structured with the contemporary, the 3-act structures. There's not a climax. There's usually not main characters you're following. And actually, like Marty Walsh seems more like a protagonist than I can recall seeing in most of your films. And yet, whenever I reach the end of one of your movies, I'm like, here comes the closing credit. I feel like the experience has been summed up and ended.
Well, that's good. That's just what I want you to feel. Because I work very hard on the structure of the movie, because what I'm trying to do in the editing is to create a dramatic narrative, not in a traditional sense of a fiction film, although I'd make the argument that my films are fiction films too, but that's another question. As I indicated a moment ago, I really know nothing about the subject matter before I start. And that's been true of almost every film I made, with a possible exception of City Cut Follies. And during the shooting, my goal is to accumulate footage, as much footage as I can on as many different aspects of the daily life of the place that's the subject of the movie, but with absolutely no idea about theme or point of view or structure. Then when I get back to the editing room, I look at all the rushes, the material that it's shot is called a rush or rushes. And that takes me about 6 weeks. And then at the end of that 6 weeks, I will have set aside about 50% of the material. And then I will begin to edit the sequences that I think might make it into the final film, still with no idea of structure or even point of view. And that will take me 6 or 7 or 8 months. It took me about 7 months, I think, in City Hall. And only when I've edited all the so-called candidate sequences do I begin to work on the structure. And then after I've edited in close to final form all the sequences I think I might use, I make the first assembly of the film in 3 or 4 days. And that usually comes out to maybe 30 or 40 minutes longer than the final film. Then over the next 6 weeks, I work on the internal rhythm within a sequence and the external rhythm between the sequences. In other words, I'm trying to create a dramatic structure by both the sequences I choose, the way they're edited, and the order in which they're placed in the film. And then when I think the film is done, I go back and review, in the case of City Hall, all 104 hours. And then I'm done, the postpartum depression sets in, and I start thinking about what to do next. I'm sorry, it's a long answer, but that's
No, that's exactly what I wanted to know.
okay.
Now, you mentioned meetings, like the meetings in your films are incredible things. And I think every single review, my own included, everyone comes up to the cannabis shop meeting in this film. It's about 2/3 of the way through the film.
Right.
First of all, how do you pick? Do you go through like, okay, this one sounds interesting. Do you have a city schedule and you circle it? Or when you're watching a scene like that, do you like look at John and like, oh, we got this one?
Well, no, I mean, it's different. I mean, when I was told there was going to be a community meeting about the opening of a cannabis store, I wanted to go. So I went. They told me where it was and what time it was. And so I went. And then, I spoke to the people who were presenting, and I also explained to the public, the members of the public were there, what I was doing. And then the meeting started. And so I think the meeting lasted probably, I've forgotten, 2.5 hours. What you see in the film is 26 minutes. And that's a long sequence for any film. It's certainly a long sequence for any one of my films. But I thought what went on there was, I thought it was both interesting and very complicated. Because here, what you have in that meeting is a group of Chinese businessmen who wanting to open a marijuana store in I've forgotten whether it's Roxbury or Dorchester, in a community that was heavily Cape Verdean, Black, some whites, and where there was a lot of poverty. And so that in the course of discussion, whether the community wanted to have the store, and of course, there were lots of questions raised as to whether the people present represented the community. There were some that felt that it did and some that felt that it didn't. But in the course of the discussion, you learned about crime in the community, you learned about police protection, you learned about parking problems, you learned about people smoking marijuana in back alleys, you learned about concern for the consequences for the neighborhood if for parking problems if cars were lined up and double parked to go into the store. You learned about a possible conflict between the Asian owners and the community, and whether the existence of the store might lead to training of employment for community members, and perhaps sufficient knowledge for others to open their own store. So, I mean, and I'm just beginning to describe some of the issues raised in the meeting, and at the same time, you get to have a look at who the people are that live in the community, because there are lots of close-ups of people at the meeting, and you hear them talking, you hear their concerns, you hear their voices, and you also see pictures of people who aren't talking, and you get a sense of what a community meeting was like, and some sense of the issues in the community. So that's a long way of saying I found it a complex and interesting, and it's of necessity a long sequence. But again, it's a reduction from about 2.5 hours to 26 minutes.
Right. So I've got another question here. On Band of Skrulls, I don't know if they're talking about the focus on Walsh's speaking engagements, and how the movie ends at Symphony Hall with a performance. And what is your sense of the importance of performing politics to social and government order, and how that leads to tangible?
Well, I mean, all politicians are to some extent actors, but I mean, whether they are actors that can perform a variety of roles, they're more than the most of us probably, because they have to, they deal with different audiences all the time. It's one time the mayor is talking to a group of elderly people in Roxbury. Another time he's talking to a group of wealthy developers in one of the new skyscrapers in downtown Boston, and in I forgot what's the area called, Bay, and another time he's talking to nurses who are striking because they're not getting enough pay. And each time, and another time he's talking to a group of veterans. And it's true that any politician, and certainly Mayor Walsh, has to choose what he says and the way he says it, and depending on who the audience is. But my impression was, and I hope that comes across in the film, is that in each situation, he's talking directly and sincerely, and often talking about his own experience. For instance, when he talks to the veterans on Veterans Day, he recognizes that many veterans have drug problems or regular, heroin addiction problems and opioid problems. So he talks about his experience as a recovering alcoholic. Well, it's very relevant, and it's a story he tells to different audiences, but it's very moving nevertheless. And it's important because he's conveying to the people he's talking to that despite the existence of those problems, he's had a good career. He was able to overcome them. So he's trying to offer them some hope to overcome similar problems of addictions that some of them may have. So, I mean, what's implicit in that question also is whether people act for the camera. And in my experience, people don't act for the camera because, or if they try to, it's so apparent as it's instantly obvious. If people could change their behavior because their pictures were being taken, then everybody would be Meryl Streep. And everybody isn't Meryl Streep. I mean, she's an extraordinarily talented woman and has a gift that the rest of us don't have. And with somebody, I mean, whether you're a documentary filmmaker or a film critic or an insurance salesman or a used car salesman or the mayor, you have to have a good bullshit meter in order to survive. Otherwise, you get taken advantage of. And similarly, I like to think of somebody's acting for my benefit. I don't use it, but in my experience, it happens so rarely as to not be a problem.
So we were talking a little bit about this before we went live, but thanks to coronavirus, I used to go into Boston every day and have not been in downtown since March 10th. I've been staying out here in Wakefield. And watching this movie was this unexpectedly emotional experience because you made me nostalgic for where I live. There's the watching it, with all the gatherings, and there's really like it's almost a queasy moment when Mayor Walsh is talking about the low unemployment. And what do you think? The movie is almost like a document of normalcy right before the outbreak hit.
Yeah, well, I think it is. I mean, because that's my interest. I'm interested in documenting ordinary experience. Mm-hmm. And this is a film about the ordinary experience of employees of City Hall and the citizenry that they deal with.
So I'm wondering, speaking of the pandemic, so you're in France. Are you locked down? Are you not going out?
I'm locked down. I have a small apartment here, and I leave only to buy bread or occasionally early in the morning to take a walk because the virus has spiked here again. In the spring, I was lucky. A bunch of different friends invited me to their houses in the countryside, but I've exhausted my freeload possibilities. So I'm in my apartment.
Now you've got a fairly rigorous work ethic. How are you coping with that? Are you have new projects you're cooking up, or
is my what? I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the.
How you have such a rigorous work ethic? How are you doing with staying at home? I mean, we're used to a Fred Wiseman movie every year. Like everybody else who's confined, I occasionally get depressed, but I'm reading a book that was written, I think, in 1804, called Voyage Around My Room, which written by a French nobleman that was confined to his room because he killed somebody in a duel, which is a bit different than the plague, but it's interesting nevertheless, and it's funny. But I find that I spend a lot of time daydreaming, but I also spend a little time, not as much time as I'd like, reading. I spend a lot of time on the internet.
I try to exercise for an hour and a half every day. So I'm doing my best to keep my morale up, and occasionally I'll go for a walk with a friend, or before the confinement of last week, there were a lot of restaurants where you could eat outside, and I could meet somebody for lunch or dinner and feel reasonably secure because we were eating outside. That's no longer the case. And and I have the same feeling I'm sure I share with everybody. I mean, it feels interminable, and the fact that it's going to last for another 8 or 10 months is interminable.
So do you have anything you're working on that you want to?
Well, no, I'm working on a script for a fiction film, which I was going to shoot this fall, but the COVID made that impossible. And I hope I'll be able to shoot it in the spring. It's a monologue. I like to have done another monologue, and I like doing that. And I'll be able, so if the COVID subsides, I'll be able to do it in the French countryside with a crew not much bigger than the crew I ordinarily use for the documentaries.
I don't know if you take suggestions, but I was thinking Frederick Wiseman's 4 Seasons Total Landscaping. I don't know if you heard about that. The 4 Seasons Landscaping Company, where Giuliani had his press conference. I don't know how much you followed that.
No, what's the 4 Seasons Landscaping Company?
There was an announcement that Giuliani was going to be making a press conference at the 4 Seasons, and it turned out they had booked a landscaping company.
Oh, I didn't know that.
A hotel, it was in northern Pennselsvania. So I was thinking, like, if it wasn't for COVID, you could go in there and really get the day-to-day of the landscaping.
Well, Giuliani is high comedy if it wasn't so serious.
We're coming up on time. I just want to tell you what a great honor this was for me. I was so happy to.
Well, thank you, Sean. I'm very pleased you did the interview, and nice to meet you.
All right, it's a pleasure. Thanks to the Coolidge, everyone. Please rent City Hall from the Coolidge Corner's virtual screening room and make a donation while you're at it.